On September 3, 1949, a specially equipped B-29 flying east of the Kamchatka Peninsula detected the presence of radioactive residue from the blast of Joe 1, the first Soviet atomic test. Only months before, the AEC had deployed a system for the sampling and analysis of evidence from an above-ground nuclear detonation.
Some of us were not surprised. Some of us thought that they would be right on our heels, so to speak, and clearly they were. There were other people, primarily in the government, that thought that it would take them a much longer time.
There were a couple of important people who said it would take a long time, General Groves and Vannevar Bush. But even Vannevar Bush said it'll take 20 years unless they give it the highest priority, which is exactly what they did.
So we underestimated the speed with which they could move. We failed to understand the degree of assistance in 1948-49 that the Soviets had obtained from spies in the West.
The detection of the test immediately put in train a number of actions by the president. In the next month, for example, he approved a request by the JCS to very largely increase the capability for producing nuclear materials.
The approval of the Special Advisory Committee's recommendations set in motion a series of events. Increased production of fissile material at the plutonium processing facility in Hanford, Washington, accelerated production of the new Mark IV bomb at Los Alamos, and construction of nuclear weapons storage facilities around the country.
And then they increased everything. They not only increased the production of U-235 and plutonium, they began a vigorous exploration of the Colorado Plateau to find more uranium.
I think they were making it up as they went along. We were all making it up as we went along. The executive branch on the one hand and the legislative on another. There's no question. I mean, it was a very revolutionary time. We were dealing with something that nobody had ever had before.
The Soviet possession of the atomic bomb ended the United States nuclear monopoly. This would profoundly affect defense policy and war planning.
The military strategy depended completely on the capacity for our monopoly of the nuclear weapons to deter and counterbalance the very large conventional forces which the Soviet Union had.
As early as August 1947, the Joint War Plans Committee began drafting a series of contingency war plans that authorized an ever-increasing role for atomic weapons. Half Moon was the first of these plans, approved during the Berlin crisis of 1948.
There's a witch's brew of names that you have from those days as you move from Half Moon to Trojan to Off Tackle to what have you, and then all the supporting war plans, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, you have a joint outline war plan and you have supporting plans for it. And the joint outline war plan that the JCS approved will take whatever the strategic concept is and put it into play.
In the absence of detailed higher-level guidance, those involved in nuclear war planning carried over what they knew from World War II, including a sense that they were involved in an enterprise of precision targeting. They carried over the same sense of target categories. They carried over the same sense that nuclear weapons were primarily blast weapons.
A nuclear weapon has, in addition, radiation, fire, which are difficult to predict. They're difficult to calculate. The planning of nuclear weapons tends not to include these effects simply because they are so difficult to calculate, but they're there. The earliest weapons, of course, were uranium bombs, fission bombs. These were delivered by high-altitude, long-range bombers. But the accuracies of these early systems were measured in terms of large fractions of a nautical mile or maybe even a couple of nautical miles. So the suitable targets had to be large area targets.
In late 1949, a new emergency war plan dubbed Off Tackle called for attacks on 104 urban targets with 220 atomic bombs, plus a re-attack reserve of 72 weapons. The prime targeting objective was to disrupt the Soviet will to wage war.
The targeting categories were completely consistent with targeting philosophy and some operations in World War II. The first one was Bravo, which stood for blunting of nuclear forces and nuclear capability. The second one was Delta, which stood for destruction of the urban industrial base. And the third one was Romeo, which stood for retarding an enemy's ability to mobilize.
This was our short-term war plan. And within the next 18 months, there was nothing other than the air offensive, and within the air offensive, specifically the nuclear component of it, which carried any chance of affecting the outcome of the war early on.
What impact would this have on the defense of Western Europe? Would the president be more cautious in the face of Soviet provocation? By the end of 1949, Truman was forced to re-examine national security policy in light of a nuclear-armed adversary.
With the explosion of the first Soviet atomic bomb, the United States felt vulnerable really for the first time. How much is enough for deterrence? Herb York in his book says that logically it would have been enough to have fission weapons, and I believe that. But politically, it is not enough, especially when you say the other side, because we can think of a super weapon, they might think of a super weapon and build it.
The primary reason for the development of the super, for ultimately instituting a fairly aggressive program to develop the super, was fear of the Russians.
People who a year or so before had been committed to the idea of international control of atomic weapons now have made a dramatic shift toward the idea of keeping ahead of the Russians.
Knowledge of the super, as the hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb was first known, was closely held in the fall of 1949. Its development was the focus of a vigorous debate among fewer than 100 people in the U.S. government. Senator Brian McMahon, chairman of the powerful Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, and General Omar Bradley, chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff, were among those who supported building a super bomb and believed that we should get ahead as quickly as possible. Truman also heard from those who opposed its development.
Well, the Atomic Energy Commission itself, that is the 5 atomic energy commissioners, were divided on the subject. The president set up a special subcommittee to study the question.
The Special Committee of the National Security Council consisted of AEC Chairman David Lilienthal, Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, and Secretary of State Dean Acheson.
That committee met for 2 months, and at the end of January reported to Truman and essentially recommending that he go forward with the development of the hydrogen weapons. That was something that was very much contested and argued about and debated within the administration, but nevertheless, the committee recommended it, and President Truman, in about 7 minutes, approved it.
He had no doubt in his mind that it has to be done if it works. The idea that something is too good for us to work on just did not make any sense to him. He never said that, but that is my feeling of him.
He also directed his principal advisors on security to produce for him a study as to how U.S. strategy would be affected by this new development. It looked at the larger question of what should we do about our relations and policy toward the Soviet Union.
Delivered to the president on April 5, 1950, NSC 68 was a seminal policy document on U.S. national security. Written largely by Paul Nitze, NSC 68 reaffirmed the character of the Soviet threat contained in the earlier NSC 20/4, but now the threat was seen as imminent.
In 1954, it was called a year of maximum danger. It assumed that they would have about 200 weapons, and that this would be quite sufficient to do tremendous harm to the United States.
Which, in my view, was greatly exaggerated, because, various of Nitze's estimates then, before that, and after that, about where the Russians were and where they were going to be, were all of them greatly exaggerated.
Paul Nitze was a very skilled infighting bureaucrat in the way that he conducted NSC 68. He talks about it freely in several of his books. NSC 68 was delivered, Dean Acheson, as Secretary of State, basically with Nitze had made the fundamental decision that they didn't want to lay the budget figures out in front of Truman. So NSC 68 was kind of the start of a debate when it gets delivered to the White House in the spring of 1950.
But Truman wasn't about to take Nitze's or Acheson's word for it, and set about evaluating the implications as well as the probable cost for the massive nuclear and conventional buildup called for in NSC 68. Within 2 months, however, this careful and deliberative effort would be cut short by a new military imperative.
By the middle of 1950, the North Koreans had a fully trained and equipped army. The Russians had seen to that. The day came when it was revealed what had all along been the communist plan, the invasion and seizure of South Korea. The invasion got underway on the morning of Sunday, June 25th, 1950.
The invasion of South Korea was a surprise like the Berlin blockade of 1948 and the Soviet atomic test of 1949. Individually, these events prompted the evolution of U.S. strategic nuclear policy. Taken together, they sparked a massive buildup of the nation's nuclear and conventional forces.
Many people attach that buildup to NSC 68. I myself have never been sure that there was quite that close a connection. We had a war on our hands. We had tremendous concern and sense of danger in Europe.
The Korean War hit, and the nature of the decision-making process becomes different almost overnight. And NSC 68, it's one of those peculiarities of history that it happened to be available at the time it did.
But it was really the shock of the Korean attack which led Truman immediately to take the lid off of the defense budget. In the United States, there had been great shock that first that war had come about, and there was shock in Europe as well, because it looked as though the Soviets might be on the march. That's when the European countries decided to ask the United States to send Eisenhower to be the commander.
You have the wholehearted backing of the people of the United States, and I know that you'll have that same backing from the 11 other nations who are in the Atlantic Treaty. Goodbye and good luck.
In the fall of 1950, intelligence assessments delivered to Truman suggested that a window of vulnerability had now opened. Would the U.S. become more vulnerable while it was increasingly drawn into the Korean conflict and before rearmament could restore the strategic balance? The prospect of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe now deeply concerned Truman and Eisenhower.
By winter, the UN forces faced once again the possibility of being driven from Korea. Discouraged, outnumbered, ill-equipped to handle the cold, they barely hung on through the freezing Korean winter.
After we had poured basically all the ready forces we had available into the Korean conflict, it was anybody's call as to where Korea was going to go at that point, whether we'd lose the war, whether the Soviet Union would intervene, things of that sort. It was a very desperate situation.
There was a good deal of talk about trying to estimate what was called the date of maximum danger. Many proposals were in the air that if this is going to happen, it should be headed off.
After the Soviets tested in 1949, it was understandable that the United States began to contemplate whether it would be appropriate and indeed necessary for national security to attack Soviet nuclear targets. But Harry Truman rejected the notion that the United States would deliberately precipitate a war against the communist adversary. At the same time, there were a number of military officers who rejected Truman's view.
And so people like LeMay and others in the early 50s, when we were way ahead of the Russians in the development of bombs and in the accumulation of them, took the view that war is inevitable, and the longer we wait before it comes, the worse off we're going to be.
Now, Stuart Symington, who was the chairman of the National Security Resources Board, had previously been the first Secretary of the Air Force, delivered a report to the National Security Council. Recommended policies and actions in light of the grave world situation. In the fall of 50 or 51, the calls for preventive war, the serious calls that would be considered at the National Security Council, was NSC 100, in my estimation. Any further Soviet aggression in areas to be spelled out would result in the atomic bombardment of Soviet Russia itself. Declaratory policy, atomic bombardment automatic. The closest you get to a call for preventive war is this document, in my estimation. And the National Security Council discussion makes it clear that even the principal author of the document, or the principal sponsor of the document, himself was not calling for preventive war. Now, it's a very different question as we get into the Eisenhower years of how you best use the nuclear stockpile of the United States as a psychological tool.
As nuclear weapons became more firmly rooted in United States defense policy, their growth in yield would become central to the psychology of deterrence.
The natural power of the universe is harnessed in the new atomic bomb. Its tremendous possibilities are explained in this chart.
In just a few years after 1949, we had weapons, pure fission weapons, of 50 kilotons instead of 10 to 20 kilotons. They were very fine nuclear weapons, and we didn't have to have a hydrogen bomb, a super, and besides, we didn't know how to make it. Other people felt that we had to have enormously superior power in order to destroy the Soviet Union.
The policy, as I understood it, was a clear understanding that the purpose was one of deterrence, that we should be ready with something more powerful. Some nuclear weapons made deterrence much stronger.
The development of the hydrogen bomb at Los Alamos was part of a much bigger effort to expand our entire nuclear weapons program, including the production of materials, the mining of uranium, etc.
In 1950, there were 8 sites and 55,000 employees. There were 20 sites 3 years later and 142,000. And this very dramatic growth continued in the 1950s and the 1960s.
Immediately following the detection of the first Soviet atomic test, President Truman authorized successive expansions of the nuclear weapons complex that included plans for a second laboratory in Livermore, California. Meanwhile, at Los Alamos, Edward Teller and his colleagues fervently sought a practical design for the hydrogen bomb based upon a fusion reaction within liquid deuterium.
There were contributions from a number of people, but the driving force was Teller. I mean, he was relentless and took it up with everyone he could interact with.
Stan Ulam came in to see him at Los Alamos. Stan Ulam, mathematician who'd been at Los Alamos for quite a while, and said, you know, Edward, if we compress this liquid deuterium, we can make it work. The reaction rate will be bigger and all that.
The idea was that you put a nuclear weapon inside of a container, and for a few moments, the container will contain not only the bomb, but the energy it produces, and that energy can be used for other things, such as perhaps compressing a secondary.
Teller said, well, it won't work, but if you were going to do it, you should use the radiation, because all of the energy comes off in radiation, thermal radiation, and that goes faster, it can be tailored more simply.
At that time, I presented a new design in which I had full confidence. We needed the powerful, concentrated energy of a primary to make the compression. Once you made it, the secondary worked much better. And that was the whole secret.
Now, Teller asked me to devise an experiment to demonstrate that this concept would work. By July 25th, 1951, I had a big sketch of what turned out to be Mike.
There were no new ideas, but a very competent write-up as to the actual proposal and how it should manifest itself and be proved in a test.
Minus 10 seconds. 9er, 8, 7, 6, 5er, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Mike was tested in November of 1952, just a few months after Livermore was established. So Livermore, of course, had nothing to do with it, although the press often gave us the credit, and we were not allowed to deny it for reasons of secrecy. So the weaponization took place entirely at Los Alamos. The development of an emergency capability based directly on the deliverable version of Mike.
Its success seems so assured that it is considered a proof test of one of the emergency capability weapons.
Emergency capability weapons were sometimes produced by the Atomic Energy Commission before the concept was tested. It was so urgent they felt to have these capabilities that if a test was successful, then they would have had the weapons in the stockpile capable of delivering.
After Mike, we had the Dirks operation where we went through the development of the jughead, the runts, the shrimp. When runt worked so well, then that was our first so-called deliverable 20-ton thermonuclear device. When thermonuclear weapons were first developed, what it did was gave you more megatons for the buck, so to speak.
Before and in the early stages of the thermonuclear weapon, attention was focused on the very large yields, energy releases available. In fact, the impact of the thermonuclear weapon was not that of enormous yield. It was to make it possible to have vastly more weapons with a limited stock of uranium-235 or plutonium-239.